They said he didn't belong here, not because he broke the rules, not because he disrespected the community, but because of his last name, accent, and the country he once called home. This man had worn the uniform, fought for the flag, and bled for the freedoms his neighbors claimed to cherish. Yet, after 9/11's, suspicion became a weapon and the whole became a battlefield. Vines, threats, whispered accusations, all aimed at pushing him out. But what happens when the soldier they try to erase refuses to back down? At first, everything seemed normal. The house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac with a flag gently swaying on the porch and kids riding bikes in the late afternoon sun. It was the kind of neighborhood that sold itself on the promise of safety, order, and pride, where the Ho insisted every lawn look perfect and every mailbox match. For years, families had lived under those rules without much thought. But after 9/11's, things changed. Patriotism wasn't just encouraged, it became a test. Those who waved the biggest flags and spoke the loudest about loyalty were suddenly the judges of who belonged. Suspicion grew sharper, fueled by fear and whispers. A new line was drawn, one you couldn't see on paper, but everyone felt. It was supposed to be a fresh start for the family moving into that house. He was a veteran who had served in uniform overseas, believing that sacrifice meant acceptance. His wife dreamed of peace, of a backyard where their children could grow up without worry. They wanted what every family in that neighborhood wanted: stability, community, and a sense of home. But almost immediately, cracks began to show. A sideways glance at the grocery store. A question that felt less like curiosity and more like suspicion. A note slipped under the door about rules that no one else seemed to follow. The Ho, once faceless, started to feel personal. It wasn't about lawns or mailboxes anymore. It was about control, about reminding them, in quiet, calculated ways, that they were different. The dispute that would soon unravel wasn't just about paint colors, flags, or fences. It was about something far more profound. And it was only a matter of time before the community's thin layer of order became a. The first letter arrived folded neatly in a white envelope and slipped into the mailbox like any other community notice. At first, it looked routine, a reminder about lawn care and mentioning Ho standards. But then came the line that felt like a warning, not a suggestion. Your property does not reflect the patriotic values of this community. What did that even mean? The lawn was trimmed. The house was freshly painted. The flag hung from the porch like everyone else's. Yet somehow, it wasn't enough. Within weeks, more letters followed. Complaints about the shade of paint on the shutters, even though 3 other homes had the same color. A warning about the size of the backyard shed, despite being smaller than the one across the street. Each fine grew larger, and each accusation sharper. And then came the whispers. Neighbors who once waved began crossing the street instead. Kids stopped playing with his children. At neighborhood gatherings, conversations cut off when he approached. One man muttered loud enough to hear that people like him had no business living here, not after what had happened to the country. It wasn't just rules anymore. It was suspicion wrapped in paperwork. The Ho had become an enforcer, pushing him closer to the edge with every citation. The fines stacked like bricks, a wall to box him in until he broke or left. Still, he refused to back down. He had fought in a war thousands of miles away. He had endured worse than nasty letters and cold stares. But here, in his neighborhood, the battle felt heavier, because it wasn't strangers this time. It was the people who were meant to be his neighbors. When he painted his fence, the Ho claimed the color violated community aesthetics. When he parked his truck in the driveway, they said it looked too military. And when he displayed a small banner honoring his unit, the Ho called it unimproved signage. No matter how harmless, each action became evidence to push him out in their case. But the breaking point came when one board member suggested in a meeting, recorded in the minutes, that his family might be a security concern. That single phrase turned quiet prejudice into open hostility. Suddenly, anonymous notes appeared in his mailbox, questioning his loyalty. A neighbor left a message saying, "Why don't you prove you belong here and take that flag down? It's not yours." The Ho didn't stop the harassment. They fueled it. Instead of defending him, they doubled the fines, citing community complaints. Every letter read more like an eviction notice, daring him to give up. And still, he stayed. He patched the fence. He mowed the lawn twice a week. He logged every letter, every fine, every cruel note. Each one became part of a record, a silent collection of proof. He knew this wasn't just about rules. This was about dignity, about belonging, about refusing to be erased. But as the harassment escalated, so did the stakes. Rumors spread that the HOA was preparing legal action, a forced lien against his property. They could take his home if he couldn't pay the mounting fines. The roof he thought would shelter his family could be ripped away by the people who once welcomed him with a handshake. And then came the night that changed everything. A knock at the door past midnight. A complaint that his porch light, a single bulb glowing in the dark, violated community quiet hours. A violation so absurd it almost felt like a trap. Behind the letter was something worse, a note scribbled on scrap paper that read, "Go back where you came from." That was the moment it became undeniable. This wasn't about grass or fences. This was about who they believed he was, and who they thought he wasn't. The battle lines were no longer hidden, and as the HOA prepared to tighten its grip, he prepared for something they never expected, to fight back. The meeting room was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, neighbors shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with tension. The HOA board sat at the front like judges on a stage, papers stacked high, their voices clipped and rehearsed. They had spent months building this moment, the night they would finally put him on trial in his neighborhood. The charges spilled from their mouths: unapproved paint colors, unauthorized signage, improper vehicle storage, disruptive behavior. But the words behind the words were clear. This wasn't about a shed or a flag. This was about who he was, and they were ready to strip him of his home to prove he didn't belong. Then came the line that stopped the room cold. The president of the HOA leaned into the microphone and said, "We have to consider whether his presence poses a security concern for this community." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who had quietly supported him stiffened in their seats. Others nodded, satisfied that the suspicion they'd whispered for years was finally given an official voice. His children sat frozen in the back row, eyes wide, watching as their father was painted as a threat. Not a neighbor, not a veteran, but an enemy. For a moment, its weight all pressed down. The months of fines, the anonymous notes, the stares, the muttered slurs. Now it had come to this, an open attempt to erase his family from the neighborhood under the guise of safety. But what the board didn't know was that he had come prepared. He stood, calm but unshaken, holding a binder thick with pages. Each letter, each fine, each threat was carefully documented. He had recorded the board meetings, collected the anonymous notes, and photographed the selective enforcement. He had even obtained the official minutes where the word security concern had first appeared, proof that the board had crossed the line from governance into prejudice. And then, in a voice that carried across the silent room, he read one of the anonymous notes aloud. "Go back where you came from." He held it up for all to see, the handwriting jagged and hateful. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is what your rules have become. Not about lawns, not about paint. About this, about fear, about hate." Murmurs swept the room. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing how far things had gone. Others crossed their arms, unwilling to admit what was unfolding in front of them. But the moment was no longer controlled by the HOA. It was his. And then came the final blow. From the back of the room, his attorney stepped forward, a quiet figure few had noticed until now. She carried a folder marked with the seal of the state's Civil Rights Commission. With measured words, she announced that a formal complaint had been filed against the HOA, citing discrimination, harassment, and violation of fair housing laws. The board president's face went pale. The room erupted, voices shouting, neighbors demanding answers, others storming out. For the first time, the power the HOA had wielded so ruthlessly cracked in full view of the community. Yet, even in that chaos, the board tried to push back. They insisted the fines were valid, the rules neutral, the enforcement fair. But the evidence was undeniable. Selective citations, racially charged language, intimidation disguised as policy. The facade of authority crumbled under the weight of their own words. And then, almost poetically, a voice from the crowd cut through the noise. An older veteran who had remained silent for months stood and saluted the homeowner. "He served this country," he said firmly. "What have you done but tear it apart?" Silence fell. For the first time, the shame shifted away from the man they tried to expel and landed squarely on the board that had weaponized rules to mask their prejudice. But the fight wasn't over. Legal battles still loomed. The Ho still had claws, money, and neighbors willing to back them. What happened in that room was only the beginning of the reckoning. And as he walked out that night, binder in hand, children by his side, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The Ho had declared war on the wrong man. Because this time, he wasn't just fighting for his home. He was fighting for the principle that no one should be forced out, silenced, or shamed because of who they are or where they came from. The storm had broken. The truth was out. But the question remained, would justice finally catch up with those who hid behind rules and flags to disguise their hate? The fallout came faster than anyone expected. The story spread beyond the neighborhood within weeks of that explosive Ho meeting. A local reporter, tipped off by someone in the audience, published an article titled "Veteran Branded a Security Threat by Ho." The headline hit like a lightning strike. Suddenly, what the Ho had hoped to contain within four walls was out in the open for the entire community, and eventually the whole city, to see. Calls poured in. Veterans groups, civil rights advocates, even neighbors who had stayed silent now spoke with anger and disbelief. The board that once held absolute power is now under scrutiny from every direction. And the Civil Rights Commission didn't wait. Investigators arrived, combing through years of records, finding patterns the homeowner had known: selective enforcement, disproportionate fines, vague language weaponized against families who looked or sounded different. For the first time, the Ho was no longer the hunter, it was the hunted. The legal case stretched for months, but the tide had already turned. Every fine that once felt like a threat now became evidence of abuse. Every rule cited against him became part of the record showing discrimination. The board tried to claim neutrality, insisting they had enforced standards equally, but their meeting minutes betrayed them. Phrases like security concern, community image, and patriotic values now read like open confessions. When the ruling came down, it was decisive. The Civil Rights Commission found the Ho guilty of discrimination and harassment. They were ordered to rescind all fines, pay damages to the family, and undergo mandatory training. Worse for them, the state stripped several board members of their positions, citing misconduct. What had once been an untouchable institution collapsed under its own arrogance. For the family, the relief was overwhelming. The lien threats disappeared. The notes stopped. Neighbors who had once avoided them began stopping by again, some with apologies, others with casseroles or quiet words of support. The children, once shunned, found themselves invited to birthday parties again. Slowly, cautiously, the neighborhood began to rebuild the trust it had lost. But the victory wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. The man who had been told to go back where you came from was recognized publicly and legally as someone with every right to belong. His service, sacrifice, and dignity had finally been acknowledged in the face of the prejudice that tried to erase him. And the Ho, its downfall carried a message larger than the community itself. Other neighborhoods took notice. Residents who had quietly endured similar treatment saw that it was possible to fight back. That in Ho, no matter how powerful it seemed, was not above accountability. Of course, scars remained. Trust, once broken, is never easily mended. Neighbors still resented the outcome and whispered about troublemakers and outsiders. But their voices no longer carried the same weight. They had been exposed, their prejudice dragged into the light for all to see. For the homeowner, the resolution was not just about winning. It was about reclaiming something more profound, the belief that, though slow, justice still mattered. He had fought battles overseas for freedoms that felt abstract. Here, in his own cul-de-sac, he fought for those freedoms again, but this time, for his own family, his own right to stand on his porch beneath his own flag. As Patriot Day rolled around the following year, the neighborhood gathered for its usual commemoration. Flags lined the street, candles lit the sidewalks, and children held sparklers in the fading light. But this time, something was different. The man once painted as a threat was asked to lead the ceremony. He stood at the front, his uniform neatly pressed, his voice steady as he spoke not of division or fear, but of resilience, unity, and the cost of true freedom. Many cried that evening, not out of guilt, but of the realization that patriotism isn't about suspicion. It's about standing together, even when fear tempts us to turn against one another. The whole dispute had started with rules and fines. It had twisted into prejudice and hate. But it ended with a reminder: justice is possible, even in the smallest corners of America. And as the lights dimmed, as the candles burned down, one question lingered in the air, a question that extended far beyond that cul-de-sac. If freedom means anything, then who gets to decide who belongs?